Welcome to Our Justice Journey, a podcast designed to educate others on how to fight for social justice as youth and beyond. Today, I'll be interviewing social justice warrior Dr. Ijeoma Ononuju. Dr. Ijeoma Ononuju is an assistant professor and coordinator of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusive Education program at Touro University, California. Having completed his Doctor of Philosophy and Education at UC Davis, focusing on diversity and equity in school administration, Dr. Ononuju's current research examines community action and ownership within K through 12 schools, leadership, and administration. Specifically, Dr. Ononuju works with schools and communities in the development of community-driven strategies to address the learning and achievement of Black and Brown youth, with a particular focus on establishing community-based educator pipelines and anti-racist instructional and leadership practices. Dr. Ononuju has taught within teacher preparation and school administrator credential programs for the past 8 years in Arizona and California. When he is not teaching, Dr. Ononuju consults with schools and school districts throughout the state of California to lead professional development opportunities for teachers and secondary school administrators on implementing youth-centered, culturally responsive practices. In his free time, Dr. Ononuju is busy working on his web series, Black Academics, a show that highlights student voice through a teacher competition. In today's podcast, Dr. Ononuju will talk to us about the role of equity and justice in education. We are beyond grateful to have him here today to share his insight. So thank you. Our first question is, what's the difference between education and schooling?
Education is that's a good question. So, immediately when you ask that question, I think that education is intrinsic and schooling is extrinsic. But I mean, the reality of it is that school is one path towards being educated, right? So it is the means to the end, but it's not the end itself. Education is the end, it is the goal, it is the destination, and there are a lot of different paths that a person can take to becoming educated, right? We typically view schooling as the most available and the most efficient way of becoming educated. But we also know that it depends on who you are and what you do, right? And so for others, schooling is not the most efficient way. For some people, school is the most detrimental way that they can actually obtain an education. And so, we should be more expansive in our thinking about what education is and what does it mean to be educated, and what role does school play in that process, right? Because it's definitely not for. If you look at someone like Malcolm X being the most obvious example of someone who was not successful in his pursuit of education in school, but was successful in his pursuit of education beginning when he was in prison, right? And the reason why is, like I said, education is something that is more intrinsic. It is something that you desire to get, and then you find the path that'll best get you there.
Yes, I completely agree. To elaborate on that, sometimes I think in our present day society, sometimes schooling and education can be oxymorons. If you think about like the certain stuff we're talking about history, which is just, I mean, straight lies, you know what I mean? Like the schooling is actually
Right.
miseducation, you know what I mean? So yeah. So, but the goal is always education, I feel like. Our next question is, what was your school experience like growing up and how did that shape your career trajectory?
That's another great question. So when I was a kid, man, I bounced around from school to school. My parents were divorced, um, before I got to school age, and so there was always kind of um, a fight back and forth between them about whether I should go to public school or private school.
Mhm.
Uh, my mother thought public school was fine, but it was more of a like I just can't afford private school, right?
Mhm.
My father being Nigerian was like, hey, like I want my son to be in private school,
Mhm.
but he would not always follow through with paying for it. So, we would do things like I would go to a private school for a year and a half, and then my dad would stop paying, and then I would go back to a public school. But in that process, right, it was extremely revealing for me, and really when I think about it, led me into the career that I'm in now, because every time I would go from a private school to a public school, I would see the difference between the quality of education that was being received, right?
Mhm.
uh, I would go from, I remember like in high school, I transferred from a private Catholic school, my 11th grade year, back to a public school. And I remember sitting with my counselor saying, like, "You gonna take these classes?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." Like I've already been given the blueprint at the private school. You
Yeah.
can't tell me something different now. So I need to be taking these classes. You need to put me in these classes. And if I need to go get my mom, right, I'll go get my mom. And so I just remember the counselor just kind of looking at me, just like, "Oh, so you know what?" I was like, "Yeah." Like, and then and in that moment, I just realized, like, hey, I got access to information in that private sector that students in the public sector aren't getting access to.
Mhm.
um, I would also say that, like, when I was a kid, my mother, I didn't find this out until after I graduated, but my mother didn't graduate high school on time.
Mhm.
uh, so she was really kind of hands off in terms of my education. She was like, "Hey, like, you smart, you go figure it out. If it works, it works. We'll we'll
Mhm.
we'll we'll go from there." And so all of that really just kind of, I used to always feel alone and isolated in my education as a youth.
Yeah.
I played sports, football, wrestling, things like that. But while I was taking like advanced placement courses, my friends were not.
Mhm.
And so it always just made me think about, like, not just how lucky I am, but it made me see and understand the disparity between how we value certain intelligence and
Mhm.
we don't value others. How certain kids, depending on their socioeconomic background, race, etc., have access to certain information and others
Mhm.
don't, right? Like, all of those things became apparent to me. And so as I got older, I began to question it more, and really I think that's what led me into the profession I'm in now.
Yes, yes. I remember actually in a previous interview I was talking, it's kind of similar to you. He said, what pushed him to really fight for equity and stuff is when like he would go to a different school in a totally different neighborhood from where I grew up in, and just the difference of opportunities he had from like his brothers and sisters going to like the school in their community and stuff like that. So he said like just like drawing parallels, that's he said like kind of like you, that's what pushed him to fighting for equity in education. So,
But that's where equity begins, right?
mhm,
So, contrary to what a lot of people think as it relates to equity, equity is an ethic, it's a value, right?
mhm,
It begins, it's a spiritual, um it's a spiritual construct to me that we then operationalize into this idea of equity. But it begins with, if you are in a situation, particularly a situation like that gentleman or myself, right, where
mhm,
you get an opportunity to experience what it's like to go to school in another community, and et cetera, et
mhm,
cetera. If you cannot see the disparity and the difference between what you are getting and someone else is getting, and then if you are not moved to act upon that, right,
mhm.
like that's where equity begins. It doesn't begin with just saying, like, let's no, it begins with me kind of looking around and saying, this is messed up.
Yeah.
And then me saying, like, I got to do something about this. I can't just be the recipient of a better life because I had access. Like, everybody
Mhm.
has to have this. And from there it just becomes like a lifelong thing.
Yes, yes, definitely. We thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast. To further listen to this discussion, visit part 2.